Have you ever wondered if it's possible to live in sync with your cycle? Do you struggle with a negative mindset around your period? Are you wondering if it's possible to be feminist and anti-birth control? We're going to explore these questions and so much more in the Managing Your Fertility podcast, because this is about helping you live a whole and full life. I'm your host and guide, Bridget, joining you in this journey of exploration related to women's healthcare, feminism, and fertility awareness. Are you ready? Let's get started. All right. Welcome to season 3 of the Managing Your Fertility podcast. Here we go. We're kicking it off with Brandy Norton, and I'm going to jump right into introductions so we can get into the topic of sex, which everybody is waiting for here. Brandy Norton is a wife, mom, and dangerously confident, which is like so needed when you're talking about sex, right? She lives in Louisville, Kentucky with her husband of 6 years and their 2 toddlers. She has a master's in theology and professional expertise in corporate, church ministry, and nonprofit roles. She recently launched a website called goodcatholicsex.com and started pursuing a life as a stand-up comic. Brandy, I'm excited to have you here, and I want you to jump in to the topic of sex and intimacy. Before we do that, though, tell us a bit about you. What's your story? How did you come to develop Good Catholic Sex?
All right. So do we have like 10 years? I don't know. I've got a big life. The nutshell version is that I kind of went through some drifting years in my 20s. I was trying to be like a Christian, but also kind of trying to live in the fun of the world. And that led to some, confusion, awkwardness. I got super excited for the Christian faith, and to the point that I was overzealous. So I feel like I need to be praying daily for ex-boyfriends of mine because I've scared them very far away from ever wanting to be Christian. So bless their hearts. But ultimately, so I met my husband, amazing man, just the best. And we committed. We said we are going to try as best as we can to be like not getting into anything sexual before marriage. And so fast forward to the night before our wedding, my aunt corners me in the bathroom at the rehearsal dinner. And she's like, "Hey, Brandy, I've got some tips for you about sex." And I'm mortified because like we're in the bathroom at my rehearsal dinner. But I'm kind of like taking notes like, okay, like, what do you got? Yeah. I realized I was so unprepared for this. I didn't know how I was. I just had assumed like, well, when we see it in the movies, like they're not having talks with their aunt before it happens. It just happens and it seems beautiful. So I'm ready. And she's like, "Oh, whoa, here's some basic tips." I'll go into those tips later, but flash forward a couple of years, I'm in a couple years in the marriage and like, oh, wow, this sex stuff is more complicated than I realized. I'm getting a master's degree in theology and I have to do a final project to graduate. And I decided my final project, this is crazy, was to make a sex website, like a website with advice specifically for Catholics, because we have rules. Not as many as you'd think, but it's sort of tricky to navigate. You can't go to Cosmo for sex advice when you're Catholic. I mean, you could, but it's tricky. Wouldn't recommend it. So I launched this website and I was graded on it because this was a project. And the professor who was reviewing it like gave me "you barely passed. I'm only passing you because I'm being kind" kind of thing. And I was like, oh, okay. But honestly, like, yeah, so the launch that time, just, it wasn't the right timing. I was only a couple years in the marriage. I didn't really know what I was doing. So fast forward to last November, 2021, Jen Fulweiler, she's my girl. She was hosting this event called Get Unstuck. So it was a week where you get to focus on a project that you've been just not able, you've been stuck on. So I'm praying about it and trying to fall asleep one night. And it's like, oh, Brandy, you should try to relaunch this website that you put together. So I spent that week renewing it, trying to like really build it up. The new inspiration was like, okay, this shouldn't just be advice for engaged couples preparing for sex, but like, how do we support married couples that are like living it? So that's kind of what I added, was a blog feature to this for married couples. I officially publicly launched it in January of 2022. And I just posted it on like a Facebook page, like a group of people who I thought might be interested. It got 1,500 hits in 2 days. Like 1,500 unique people were looking at this website. And that's when I knew, okay, this is the grace of God, honestly. Like, only through the grace of God does this stuff take off like it does. But this is something that people really are interested in and they want. And I'm not the only one that's like, where is this? Because
No, you're not. This is amazing. I'm so happy to see this because there are so many Christian resources available or non-Christian, non-Catholic resources. And like you had mentioned about the rules, with Catholics, there's some things that were like, nope, not allowed, like masturbation, porn. And those are things that can be heavily promoted in other arenas when you're looking for tips and you're like, wait, so what's licit, what's not? And we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think this is just so helpful. So I want you to tell us more, like, what does good sex look like in marriage?
yeah, and that's what I wanted to like cover is like my website is obviously good Catholic sex because of those rules, but I want every married couple to be having good sex. And I think a lot of couples, like, I hear this in just the world of like, there's so many couples, they had a bunch of sex before they were married, and then after they get married is when they stop having sex. And it's like, wait, no, this is like when we start having it, and this is when it gets good because we're married and we're going through chaos together. And this moment of just like uniting our bodies, that's like, it's coming with all the baggage. Like I know we had a fight yesterday and it was rough, but I still love you. And like that's what the good sex is like I don't know, you hear about like makeup sex. I don't know, it doesn't need to be like the secularized version of it, but this is powerful that God has given us the gift of dopamine, oxytocin. I always want to say oxycontin, and that's not what God gave us. But these are like bonding chemicals, literally designed to like bring us closer together to feel the love more powerfully, intensely. And that's an amazing bond. Sex is good because it has the possibility of creating a new life. That's powerful. That's huge. It's also pleasurable. And if anyone listening, you're Christian, maybe you were raised kind of thinking that pleasure was shameful. Like, especially I know, you're trying to not have sex maybe, but then you're getting aroused with what you're doing. You're like, oh, I got to shut that down because not supposed to be feeling pleasure here. So you get married and you're like, oh, wait, but am I allowed to be feeling pleasure now? I don't know. Like
That's so
and I
real.
want to feel it, but it's just there's some shame around it. But it shouldn't be shameful. Like, it should be good. We should be feeling pleasure. Now, on full scope of this though, it is sex, so it's messy. You're not gonna hear this in Cosmo, but there are farts involved. Like, your children might wake up from their nap early and start screaming and trying to interrupt your like beautiful moment together. There's anatomy and basics, like they call them basics, but like it's not so simple, it's not so obvious. You kind of got to navigate and figure out like how do you even press the right buttons, and it's like there's body changes that happen, like you have a baby and suddenly your body's totally different. What does sex look like then? Illness happens. I mean, it's complicated. Sex is very complicated, but that is what makes it so good. And that's why like sex and marriage, like that's what it's for, is to like, we get to work through the complicated of our married lives, of our sex lives. Sex should not be the most important thing in our marriage, but it is important and it should be celebrated. And I mean, I just want it to be good for couples.
Yeah, I love what you said there, how it's not the only thing, it's not the most important thing, but it is a huge part of marriage. And it still is a focal point. But because I think that speaks to couples where they may be struggling and they may be abstaining for a really long time for whatever reason they've discerned. And there are those that are struggling with like, okay, well, I can't have sex all the time, or it's super limited right now. And that's frustrating. And I think it just speaks to the fact that like, it's not the main aspect of your marriage, but it still is a huge part of it. And I think we have to be honest in navigating that and understanding like that doesn't make it bad because you can or can't participate in it for whatever that reason might be for abstaining, but it is a good, and there isn't anything shameful about it. And God made it so like it can't be bad. He only makes good things.
Oh yeah, and those feelings of pleasure that are happening, I mean, we're not making that up. Like those were gifts from God. So
Yes.
for any non-Christian listeners, I mean, like, I don't know, like that's the great thing about on like the belief in God as like God, these natural things, it's gifts. So
Yes. Okay. So I have a couple questions for you related to sex, like for engaged married couples, and of course some of the practicals that you're starting to touch on. But before we jump into that, I want to take a step back and just talk about like, what do you see that's missing from conversations for young people about sex in their bodies? Because I think this is the trajectory that we're on, and we're talking a little bit about that, where the shame comes in, or the idea that like, well, if I wait and I wait and I wait and I'm good, then I'm deserving of, and I should get, and it's only fair that my sex will be amazing with my spouse once I'm married, because I saved it. I waited, like this should work. And I think like that lie honestly comes in, and we don't even realize it until we're grappling with these emotions and these feelings of shame or guilt or uncertainty or frustration or fear. So what have you seen, and what have you noticed, especially in your work as a chastity speaker as well too? You had a couple
oh
of
yes, I did not mention that in my bio, but yes, I taught sex ed, aka chastity, but I was in public schools, so I didn't say the word chastity. I just said like sex is good and it's worth waiting for. And yeah, so I taught sex ed. I did this for 2 years. I was so shocked by how little teens know. But then I think about it, I'm like, okay, I was a teenager and I didn't know anything either. But these girls, like I would get them one day where it would just be the girls and they'd be asking me questions. And they thought you got pregnant on your period. Like so many of them did. The first time I heard it, I was like, oh, that's weird. And then I heard it like at a lot of schools. So I don't know what TikTok reel was promoting this, but I'm like, no, ladies, we're not having sex on our periods. And then I'm doing research for my website and I'm finding out sometimes people are having sex on their periods, like in the shower. I don't know. You could try it if you're curious.
Not when
But
you
that's
get
not when they're
pregnant.
getting pregnant.
Yeah.
No. So just I'm sure you've had conversations like before. There's so many women that are saying we need to teach our teenagers how to chart. And I believe in that too. But the big thing for me with charting is understanding your sexual desires that come when you're ovulating. Because you're a teen girl and there's a guy that's like a total jerk, but then he smiles at you and you're ovulating and you're like, oh, hey. Like, I mean, I know my husband when he's like in sweatpants and tube socks and I'm ovulating and I'm like, oh, but this is my husband. This is like a good man. No offense to teen boys. They're good. They really are, but they don't know what's going on either.
Yeah,
Like
right.
they've been caught up in porn for too long and they're just trying to, anyway, it's a mess. So I just really want all moms, when they're having the conversation with their daughters about a period, here's how to chart and here's what sex is in light of your chart. Because
Yeah.
like if you're ovulating, don't be alone with a boy because you're not going to be making great decisions. Like
It's so
spelling that
true.
out.
Yeah, being specific, I think you're right on that note too, that there's so much that's clouding, I think, judgment as it is, thinking like you can get pregnant on your period, or you're navigating porn, or you're masturbating all the time. Like these are things that are already clouding your judgment. So like, why not inject some actual science and truth into the situation and show you like, here is how your body works and here's what's happening and why some boys are just so attractive when you're ovulating. I had a friend that she would tell us that like, we started charting in college, and we were like accountability buddies with a few girls, and one of the girls was like, she had a specific type of boy that she was usually drawn to, but she was like, oh my gosh, I realize I'm ovulating. It's my sparkly star day because every boy on campus is so hot and I
sparkly star day.
And it was like,
and I didn't chart in college, so oh gosh, no. I mean, there were some guys I'm like showing up for, and they're blackout drunk at a party, and I'm like, what made me attracted to this guy? Looking back, it's like, oh, I was probably ovulating.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
ridiculous, but it's true. You know, it feels ridiculous, but it's not. It's like real information that you can use so that you don't date stupid people. You know, and they're nice people, but they're making stupid choices.
Say also you're dating, like you're like in a relationship, it's a great girl, it's a great guy. You're trying to like have this genuine, faithful teenage relationship. I don't know if you should be dating when you're teens, but that's a whole nother topic. But I don't know, you're in college, whatever, and you're kissing. I mean, my husband's kisses taste different when I'm ovulating. Like they feel different. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I'm like, oh, that's how I know I'm ovulating, the kiss. So like, if I'm just an unmarried woman or man trying to like, live some boundaries in our physical life, but she's ovulating, oh, I mean, so much harder to navigate. So that's what I wish we talked about more. And in general, I wish we just had more candid conversations with our young boys, young girls about sex. I see a lot of moms asking like, well, how do I talk to my kids more about this? I would honestly recommend when it comes to sex, like moms should find like their sister, like the cool aunt or like a friend, someone trusted that can have that conversation. Not to say like the mom should still have some semblance of conversation about it, but kids don't necessarily want to go to their parents for the nitty gritties about sex. In general, I have a friend that says she talked to her mom all the time about sex, but I don't know. That was weird for me. So anyway, just instilling like a person in their life that your child can go to when they have tough questions. Like that's what I would recommend too.
Yeah. What do you see as a disconnect when it comes to the integration of sex and faith? Because I think we hear a lot about how amazing sex is, especially in the Christian Catholic world, especially if you wait, like I was mentioning, but there's a huge gap in amazing. And then you have two imperfect people joining their bodies together for the very first time. And we're getting all the like, it's one flesh, it's beautiful. Yeah, sure. It's also incredibly messy. So what do you see there? What do you see that disconnect? Like, what do you see its impact to on us?
Yeah, and this is the reason I created this website, because I felt the angst all the way between like me being this 20-something girl subscribing to Cosmo. It was the worst time of my life. Like I was reading Cosmo, I was watching Sex and the City, and I don't want to shame anyone who's like listening or watching that content. But you just have to be so careful with it, because it gives a different picture of sex, like very using each other, and not loving. But ultimately though, so I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, yeah, sex is good, sex is pleasurable. And I'm listening to people in my faith giving talks about sex is good, sex is pleasurable, sex is amazing. So this is great. Like I'm coming into this like, yeah, sex is amazing. Okay. Whereas I think like the generation before us, they weren't raised hearing sex is good. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of having to work through that. But I didn't have to work through that. Like I knew it was supposed to be good. But then like, I don't know, Catholic land, it gets a little weird how we talk about sex sometimes, if I'm honest. I get the theology. I mean, I studied theology, but it's like, sometimes it's analogies like when husband and wife unite their bodies in sex, it's like Jesus uniting his body to the cross. I don't know. I know it's supposed to be beautiful. I hope God doesn't strike me with lightning for laughing over that. Like my husband put a crucifix over our bed, because that's what Catholics do. We put a crucifix over our bed. I don't know. I get it. I love the crucifix. I have it in every room in our house, but over our bed, it kind of kills my vibe. We're having our marital moment and I look up and there's like a dying Jesus. I don't like, it's just like, it's such a weird thing of like, yeah, how do we integrate sex into our faith? You have to have the rock of your faith in it, because otherwise that's when it does get hyper focused on just pleasure and just about me and not about we. So I do want to always keep my faith, as part of this, because otherwise I'm going to get caught up in Cosmo land without meaning to. But
I like your honesty. I really appreciate your honesty about it, because I think there are those listening that might be like, oh, but I love the crucifix over my bed. And it's like, great. That's awesome.
That's great.
And the others are be like, oh my gosh, me too. I totally struggle with this. Like, it kind of weirds me out. And I think these are the conversations we have to have, because we have not seen sex and faith integrated. We haven't seen this idea of like, when you hear the analogy of like, two become one as Christ unites himself to the cross. And like, for some people, it's like, oh, I get it. That makes sense for me. And for others, it's like, what? But then we don't extrapolate. We're not honest. We're not having good conversations around like, are we uncomfortable with that, to explore it? And then it's like, well, we're just going to leave it at that. And then people are just walking around like, I'm really uncomfortable with this, but I guess I got to just go with it.
If I can give another quick example, it's also, we hear about like praying before sex.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some couples do it and apparently it's good and beautiful for them, but like, I feel like it's a vibe killer. I don't know. We tried to do it like once or twice and it just was like weird for us. maybe one day we'll get there. Maybe the people
Yeah.
who pray before sex, they're like way farther ahead on their walk with the Lord, and like bless them. Like maybe teach me your ways. I probably need to be walking with these people more. Like no, it's not working for us. So we're not going to force it. But that's what you
That's
hear,
okay
like
because
good Christian couples pray together before sex. And I'm like, well, but I feel like I'm doing a good Christian thing, and like I just don't feel like it's working for me to pray before sex.
right.
So.
And I think again, it's like, well, okay, well, maybe you pray at night where you're just like, Lord, give us a beautiful sex life. Like we want to be united. And like
Sure, right.
there's your prayer there. It doesn't have to be like, okay, here we
Yes, I love
go.
that.
Let's like kill it and just like pray right now. And then it's sort of like, oh, right, gotta get back in the mood here. Like
Yes.
it's just like remembering like the creativity and the ways, because it's not like we're not like this isn't good or bad. Like if you do it this way, you're good. And if you don't, you're bad. Like, no, there are totally different ways in which you can get creative to invite God into this space
Yes.
of sex without it being like, it has to be right before.
Yeah. Or you have
like,
to have the crucifix over your bed.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions that you see about sex among Catholics? Because I think we're starting to get there where we're like, okay, we're seeing this disintegration. We're seeing areas where we're just not connecting. Stuff isn't making sense.
Well, for people who aren't Catholic, I think their perception is that we have like a ton of rules, and like how could you have fun when you're having a ton of rules? So I feel like to just start with that, there are not as many rules as you'd think. But when you look into them, they all make sense, I believe. I feel like it's just like, yes, I get it. So you mentioned one of the rules is no masturbation, no pornography. And someone outside Catholic land hears that and they're like, wait, what? But what I see happens for marriages is like, if you're doing self-pleasure, then it's like, well, I don't need my spouse because I can sexually satisfy myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes very isolating because suddenly you don't need your spouse for anything. Like I don't need him to satisfy me sexually. I don't need him to just be part of my life. Like it's suddenly not about it's about me, and we're just alone together.
Mm-hmm.
I see that's probably why a lot of marriages start to drift apart, because it's not just about sex. But what I'd like to get into at some point is like marriage and sex, they're like direct reflections of each other. And I'll talk into that more later. But yeah, ultimately, I think that's the biggest misconception about sex is like there's too many rules, or like the rules are impossible. But I mean, there's not that many. It's doable. And then, I mean, we've already covered it, but like, it can be good. It can be pleasurable. We can have sex toys as long as it's like within the marital act. Like there's ways that if we're struggling with the anatomy, there's ways to make it good and better. And there's not as many rules as even like the strict Catholics, even people who are lifelong Catholics, they think like, oh, I can't have fun and enjoy this. Like we're struggling to figure out our arousal curve. We'll get a vibrator. You really can. That's licit.
Yeah.
Like, as long as you're not taking the vibrator away by yourself. As long as it's like you two together in the marital act, and you're doing this because you want to like improve your relationship together, not because like I as the female just feel this need to like get off.
Yeah, right. This totally ties in with just like, you know, my next question for you in the specifics, the practicals, like the both and of sex. Yes, it's beautiful. It's awesome. It's pleasurable. It can also be hard and messy. And there's a learning curve with this. There's always opportunity to have better sex, to grow in intimacy, to connect, because there are so many different seasons of life. If you're newly married and you've never had sex before, you have to learn in and of itself. And then as you get in a couple years, you're like, okay, let's switch things up. Oh, now we have kids. Now we're dealing with postpartum. Now we're, maybe there's some pregnancy sex, like all of these different places that like there's always room for growth. And the beauty in it is that you get to do it with the same person and really learn each other. Like that's a good thing. Like if it doesn't work, your wedding night or whenever, in your honeymoon, you're trying to have sex, you're like, this is the worst. It's going to be this way forever. No, you get to try again tomorrow in 3 hours, like whatever you want.
Well, and then the misconception I had was like, well, but like this, okay, I get it. This was harder than I thought being a newlywed, but I'm going to perfect this. And so like a year in, we've got this. And no, like we're in our 7th year of marriage, and like there's times it's great, and then the very next time it's pretty awful. Like it's pretty awful. And it's nothing against us. It's just like there's messiness in this. And we're like, as soon as you think you have it figured out, that's when you don't. Like sex
But
isn't
as
meant
in
to be
life,
figured out.
yeah.
It's like part of a journey and part of an adventure. And that's like the beautiful gift about sex and marriage.
Mhm.
It's you're just on this adventure together, figuring out your marriage, figuring out your sex life, but never actually figuring it out. Like
Yeah, because there
navigating
are
is the
so many
better word.
components that, like around communication and intimacy building outside of sex and understanding each other and figuring out like, okay, emotionally, if you're in different places, like how do you connect? Okay,
Yes.
you're worried about different things or you're stressing about different things. Like there are so many different pieces of the puzzle. And that can sound like overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, I have to have all these other areas, like ready to go, airtight containers. They're good. Now I will have great sex. Like, no, like it's life is never going to be perfect. It's
No.
messy. So like sex will be messy, but also good. And that's
Yes.
the weirdness in it. So you mentioned like with sex toys that's like that can be illicit use if you need that. Like there is nothing wrong in that. Another question I get is lube. Can I use lube? And the answer is
Yes, please do. Yeah, lubrication, just the short answer on that. It's hip for our generation to use coconut oil. I think our moms use KY. Don't use the scented or heated stuff because I feel like that's how infections happen.
yeah.
Um, we use lube like so much the first couple years, and then we learned like other ways. Like there's oral stimulation. There's other ways to like create natural lubrication. So you don't have to always be dependent on it, and it depends on your phase, depends on where you're at in your cycle.
Yeah.
We can talk about that more. There's times you're going to definitely need lube depending on where you're at in your cycle or in general. So yeah, please lubricate.
Yeah, talk to us about oral stimulation because this is another hot button topic that people get confused about. Like, wait,
Oh yeah, oh
sex? Like,
gosh,
no, oral sex is different than oral stimulation, and we're going
yes.
to talk about it.
So oral sex would be like the man is climaxing outside of the woman's vagina. We're just going to spell it out.
Yeah, do it.
Yeah. So if it's in her mouth or whatever it is, the man does need to climax inside the woman's vagina. Like that's, and when you're newlyweds, if the man's still figuring it out and he climaxes too soon, accidentally outside of the woman, that's okay. Like you didn't, that was an accident.
Yeah.
So you're still figuring it out, but no intentionally climaxing outside of the woman. But that like foreplay, very important. And foreplay is something that starts non-physical stuff at the beginning of the day where you text each other like, hey, I'm gonna enjoy seeing you tonight, like just put on some lacy underwear at the beginning of the day. So if you're a woman, so you're just kind of thinking about it throughout the day, while you're washing dishes, you're like, oh yeah, this is happening later. So you got to like build it up. And so oral stimulation is like a good part of foreplay. You don't have to orally stimulate, but I think people, it's a hurdle for them to get over because they're like, ooh, that's dirty. Like that's only what like the Cosmo people do. No, good Christian Catholic couples definitely can and like, yeah, go for it. Because if you're struggling to like build an arousal curve, oral stimulation helps with lubrication. It helps with getting you turned on. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying you have to do it, but
no, and I think
can.
that's the biggest thing is just like, you don't have to. And that doesn't mean like, oh, if I'm not doing it, I'm not going to have great sex. Absolutely not. This is all around understanding the framework and the parameters in which you can play with each other and have fun with each other and build that foreplay and help with that arousal curve. So you have to do what's comfortable. And I think that's a huge aspect of it where I think, I remember when we were engaged, a priest had said like, basically, as long as you're following, the rules of like, okay, no masturbation, climaxing in the woman, not using each other and not forcing sex, like you could like be swinging from a chandelier for all we care. And then
a
like,
priest told you that?
Yeah. And I was like, and I remember hearing that as someone that was like, oh, what? But he was basically like, you get to figure out what you're comfortable with and what you do together and how you build intimacy, but like, don't use each other. And I was like, that was scary because as someone who like very much raised with like the idea of purity culture, purity rings, save, then sex is good. It was like, wait, it's not like, I knew it wasn't just missionary position, but I was also like, wait, you can do a lot of different things. I didn't realize that because nobody talks about that. And that's another aspect, like foreplay, really important. Like you just said, also positions, like there are a variety of positions you can try to help make sure it's comfortable. It's along with like making sure it's fitting well. And you do communicate in sex where you can say, like, wow, that feels really good. Like, oh, I love that. Like, do those things. Like you won't see them in the movie because that would be weird in a movie.
Yeah. Although like there's Bridesmaids is one of my favorite movies, and it's not an appropriate scene for us good Christian girls, but the very opening scene where Kristen Wiig's having sex, and they're just making all those awkward noises, and it just cracks me up because I'm like, okay, thank you for portraying a real version of what sex sometimes looks like.
I forgot about that scene. Yeah.
Oh, it's very crude, but like
But there's something
like
that speaks to the
spot on.
reality that like this is messy. And we're not, as we're talking about this, I'm sure some people could be like uncomfortable or like this isn't being irreverent. We're trying to really like be honest about something that is
Sure.
beautiful and can be reverent. And I think that's something whenever I see more honest dialogue around, people get really like up in arms, like, oh, we're being disrespectful. It's like, no, like this isn't, we're not trying to be disrespectful or desecrating anyone's bodies. Like,
No.
we want to make sure that actually doesn't happen by having these conversations. So you're not
Yes.
abused by your spouse or you're not abusing your spouse because it can happen from men and women. It's not just like a man thing because I see that a lot.
To kind of bring it back, we were talking about, oh gosh, I lost what we were talking about, but just engaged couples.
Yeah.
And oh yeah, so it's like, yeah, there's a lot of things like oral stimulation, but hey, if all you've been doing is kissing and then you're married, don't be diving into oral stimulation necessarily. Like, you don't have to like, don't feel like, oh my gosh, I have to experiment with the whole playground right now.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, so going, like, I feel like advice for engaged couples, I don't want to tell you everything because like a lot of this you guys get to figure out yourselves, and that's good. So there can be some guides on like some basic positions to start with, or like things like using lubrication, but I don't want to give you all the details. And it's not because I'm trying to hide it from you, but it's because there's just a lot that's personal, and I want you to just kind of own it for yourselves as a couple. So I want to give you the tips and tools to help you be started. So if you look at my website, I've got a whole section for engaged couples, and it comes with a guide. Like, let's talk about our baggage, like personal reflection of like, let's think about our past relationships and what kind of damage did we do in our lives based on like maybe going too far with an ex-boyfriend, or maybe not. I don't know. It's just different. Yeah, there's things that happened. Pornography, maybe there was sexual abuse. Like, what are these things that it's so like we can talk about this, but we're not getting into the nitty gritty of our sex lives, and what, because that can be tricky to navigate. So yeah, I want people to have like a look at that guide, have that conversation, go for a hike, because there's also questions like talking about like, well, what do we expect sex is going to look like in our marriage? And what you expect it's going to look like, it's not what it's going to be, but at least you're talking about it.
Yeah, because that can really help decrease some of the frustrations. I love that.
I think a lot of men think like, oh, we're going to have sex every day, and like even songs and movies make it seem like it's normal for couples to have sex like 2 to 3 times in one day, and you just build this up in your mind. And when you're newlyweds, like, I don't know, there's some things happening.
Maybe, and all this work from home and COVID, maybe you are, and that's awesome. But also like maybe not, and that's fine too.
Yeah. So there's a lot, and it's different for everybody. But yeah, anyway, you're coming in with baggage. I want you to talk about it. I want you to talk about what your expectations are. I want you to have basic preparedness. And the basic preparedness is ultimately the tips my aunt gave me when she corded me in the bathroom. 1 is lube, which we talked about. 2 is having a towel under you. If you're a virgin, there might be some blood. Don't be scared of it. It might be a little, it might be a lot. There was like a murder scene at my wedding night. Not to scare people, but but the towel isn't just there for that. I thought that's what it was, but the towel's there for like semen's messy, and when you're first married, you're trying to figure out like, okay, how do we get out of bed without like having to wash the sheets every time? It helps to have the towel. Showering before sex, it's not like you have to shower right before sex, but just be clean, especially if it's like your wedding night and you've been sweating it out on the dance floor. Take a shower. You hear this image of like the man strips off the bride's gown and they like go for it, but like I feel like showering and calming down is totally fine. Peeing after sex, super important. The woman should pee within like 10 to 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be right away, but unfortunately UTIs can happen if she doesn't pee soon after sex. So that's the basics. Those are the 4 tips my aunt gave me. And then the really big thing though, for the virgin couples, whether it's the man, the woman, Or even just like maybe you had sex in previous relationships, but you two together haven't been. Don't feel like you have to jump into it all on your wedding night. If you had told me this when I was engaged, I would have been like, oh no, girl, I am going for it. Like I am ready. But like, do just want to encourage couples to understand that they don't have to have sex on their wedding night. Maybe you're tired, maybe you're exhausted from the stress of planning a wedding, if you remember that space. um, just like maybe you want to slowly build up your physical intimacy, like just I don't know, cuddle naked together that night and see what that's like. Um, or even just cuddle with like your clothes on and see what that's like. Wherever you're at, slowly build up to it. I will say, don't let it become a hurdle where you're like so anxious about sex. Because honestly, I was starting to get a little afraid of it. I was like, oh, blood, it might hurt a little. Like, what? I don't know. And that built it up in my mind. So on my wedding night, like, I don't think I could relax. And that's probably why there was more blood. So, like, that's why I just want women and men to consider that they can build it up, but don't wait. Don't like not have sex because you're scared of it.
Yeah, I love that.
Because one of the weird Catholic land rules that we have is that you are not fully sacramentally married until you have sex.
Mm-hmm.
So don't have to force it on your wedding night, but just don't like let it become a fear factor where you don't have it on your wedding night and then it's like a year later and you're still like, I don't know. So there's a delicate line there to walk, but those are my tips for an engaged couple.
I like that. I like that, especially identifying that fear or anxiety that might come into play, because it is messy. It's not going to be perfect. And so you may try and you may say, okay, wow, we like tried and that was really fast and quick. And we didn't like, he wasn't able to insert his penis very far, but that's okay. Like you tried and that's fine.
Yeah.
Like that's beautiful.
You didn't fail.
Right. And I think that like shame or that feelings of failure, like just being honest about that. And I think that's where like having honest conversations, maybe it's not necessarily with your fiance around like all of your fears around sex. Like it might be helpful to have that person that you feel really comfortable talking to who's married or a little bit farther in their marriage, that you can
definitely
process those feelings, because I think sometimes that it's not out of like hiding things from your spouse, but I guess from a female perspective, like he may be going through his own fears or uncertainty as well. And so
I think like I like that you said that, because honestly, you have to be so careful. Don't be like talking about your ex relationships like with each other. Like, well, I went this far and here's all the specifics you need to know about what me and my ex-boyfriend did, because you're too delicate at that stage of your relationship.
Yeah,
I couldn't have handled
time for all of that. Yeah, because some couples it's
so
like,
that's where I agree, you're right. Like,
but
understanding what conversations are good to have like with a friend, like, and versus like your fiance. But definitely talking it out.
Yeah. For married couples, what would you say some of the key takeaways are when it comes to sex? Because I know we're focusing a little bit on engaged right now, and I want to get into married couples.
Yes, because I think that's huge too. Is I want to support married couples, because it's you're navigating it. So here's the big thing that I've learned is that a good sex life is going to be a direct reflection of your marriage, and that's kind of a loaded statement, and I want to have some nuance. So like we've said, if you guys are struggling with the physical anatomy, like if you need the vibrator, if you need the lube, if those are the reasons you're struggling with sex, then focus on those. And I'm not saying you're having a bad marriage, like, but don't also start to think like, okay, we're struggling to like have a good sex life. Maybe we need to throw in the vibrator and the chandelier and all this stuff, because that's going to solve it. No, like, I think the big thing is like, how is your marriage doing? Because when my husband and I are struggling with our sex life, I can pretty quickly see like, oh yeah, because we're struggling with our marriage right now, because we're fighting all the time, and because we've stopped remembering to like truly love one another. So, and like, I mean, obviously, I've never stopped loving my husband, but like every day I should be doing actions like he's asked me to clean up my dishes after I eat. So embarrassing, but I just have this habit of I just leave my dishes on the table and then he cleans up after me. So you heard me say I'm trying to do comedy, so my joke was like, I put on our wedding day that like my dress that I'm the princess and you're my butler. So I thought cleaning up after me was part of the deal. I'm not sure why you have a problem with this. Uh, so we can get defensive, but like, no, he just asked for the simple thing. He wants me to clean up dishes, and me doing that and him feeling the love from that, that's going to translate directly to our bedroom or living room or wherever it is we're doing it, so like, that's, I think, the biggest thing for marriage is it's not about the 1,000 sex tips that Cosmo's trying to give you. Don't try to throw product after product at your sex life. Start by like, okay, how's our marriage doing?
Yeah.
And how can we better just say thank you to each other and be grateful and learn about their love language and actually do things for their love language and not get hurt when they're not following my love language, like,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's my biggest thing, I think.
I do want to note just in the comment that I had made around a priest saying like, you can do it from the chandelier. This priest is very like well-informed, well catechized, like,
Not shock your listeners.
Yeah. I mean, this was part of a longer conversation around
sure.
marriage and sex. So for those listening, if they're like, this priest, it's like, no, like it was part of a bigger conversation. I'm giving you a soundbite because I think, they're like, as with all of these topics, I mean, we're getting specific. I feel like I just need to say this again. We're getting specific for a reason to be able to help break down some of these barriers and communication barriers that are often at play when we talk about sex in Christian, especially Catholic circles. Let's be honest.
If I can do an aside about priests. So like JP2, love and responsibility, he writes out like very explicit stuff. Like if the woman has not climaxed during your sexual intercourse, then it's okay for the husband to help her climax outside of, like, after he has climaxed. And you hear, so anyway, like, I think, like, I was in studying my theology degree and I'm meeting with these seminarians. They're like, I want to be like JP too. I want to have candid conversations with married couples about sex. And I'm like, oh guys, you are way not mature enough for that. So there's Pope John Paul II, who is like very much farther on his walk with the Lord. He can have these kind of conversations with married couples. So that's what I'm going to say too. If you're listening to this as like a married person or engaged person, you're like, I want to talk to my priest about this. I mean, be careful with who you're talking to, because depending on their maturity level, they're not ready to handle you talking about all of your details of your sex life with them.
Yeah. So jumping into that topic, definitely vet with them and ask them if you are really needing some spiritual guidance, or you just want to have that like added background with, theology.
Yeah. And maybe don't go to a priest about it, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I love priests and they're great. And I want to talk to them about a lot of things, but I don't think it's appropriate to talk to priests about my sex life.
And this is too, and this is like a totally other conversation, but this is where I think priests need added training to be able to know that boundary setting for themselves, to say hey, actually, I have to talk to a therapist or a trusted friend or one of our mentor couples, because I think this is where we need Christina
100%.
NFP ambassador program to be able to identify whose role is what, because that really helps us as Catholics looking to have great sex with our spouse and be engaged in our faith and living and leaning into the sacrament of marriage. Who do we talk to when crap hits the fan? Who do we talk to when this just isn't working and it's just not fun? And I think those are
not a priest
that, like,
not a priest.
He isn't married. And I've had priests say that, like, hey, I'm not married. Like, I would recommend you talk to our mentor couple. And it's like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, and I've really appreciated priests who are honest about that and say it, because that's so necessary too. So we're getting a little tangential here, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I would love, last question here. Could you talk about this on your blog? How has Hollywood warped our expectations of our spouses? I think this is like, clincher the episode.
Yeah, in every way has Hollywood warped us. Gosh, I was raised on romantic comedies and I love them. I don't want to shame them because I'm still watching them. But like literally just this past weekend, I'm watching the 1994 Little Women. That's the only one that matters. I'll start a fight. And so I've like Joe and Professor Bear, he's like delivering the manuscript to her and she like goes to find him and they're out in the rain under the umbrella, and I just sigh and I'm like, oh gosh, Professor Bear. And then my husband walks in and he's in a great mood. He's just been on a phone conversation with one of his best friends. And he says something casual and suddenly I'm picking a fight with him over the stupidest thing. It's like a half-hour fight. It's just ridiculous. And I realized like, crap, Brandy, what you're doing is you're comparing him to Professor Bear. I'm like, oh, but Professor Bear never would have done that. Okay, Professor Bear probably would do it. He's not 6 years into marriage. Like the credits rolled as soon as they're getting together.
Yes, as true of every movie. You never see married life.
No, and my husband is better than Professor Bear. Professor Bear's a fiction, like so gosh, like just to talk about marriage, the hardest, like you hear marriage is hard, and Hollywood loves to talk about marriages falling apart. You see it all the time, marriages divorcing, but you don't see like the reality of marriage, which is just struggling through it. Marriage is not hard. What's being hard is being an imperfect person. I'm a sinful woman. I'm coming with my baggage, and now my husband's got to deal with it. And so now the person that I love the most is the person that I'm hurting the most. And that's what's hard. That's what breaks me. So, yeah, Hollywood does not help you see that.
Yeah, and we'll link to those blog posts too, where you talk about this a little bit more in depth, I think because so many probably hearing this are like, oh my gosh, I agree. And I think you just have some really great content, really diving into all the ways in which I think we forget how Hollywood can really warp our understanding of love and healthy relationships. So this has been great having you on. I've loved this. Is there anything else that you want to include that you're just like, oh, I have a burning desire to share this that I meant to share earlier or that popped into your head?
Okay.
There's so much more we can say.
Yeah, I know. Two things is like, I just want us to be able to communicate better about sex. Not with our priests, we established that, but and not to leave them out of it. I'm actually putting together a training for priests to talk about like marriage and family life. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll come back on again to chat about that. But I want you to communicate with your spouse. Talk about your sex life, talk about your marriage. I was with my girlfriends one night for a girls' night, and I was like, does anyone else overanalyze their marriage? And my friend's like, Brandy, I think that's just you. Sometimes I can like definitely overanalyze it. But a couple years later, that friend came back and she's like, Brandy, I realized that we weren't talking about our marriage and we went through a rough patch and we need to start talking about it. And I'm glad we did. So talk about what's going on in your marriage, talk about your sex life, be open, and talk with your friends about your sex life too. There's some things that are personal, so don't go into all the details, but like, otherwise you just feel like you're going through it alone. So I was out with a friend last month and I'm talking about like, oh yeah, my wedding night and that blood. And I'm making a joke about it, but she like her eyes widen and she's like, that was me too. And like, she just had this relief, like, oh, I wasn't the only one that had this like semi-traumatic situation happen.
Yeah.
And now we can laugh about it. It's less traumatic, like it happened, but like, so don't go into all the details, please. There's things that are private between you and husband and wife, but don't feel like you're navigating this alone. So to find a trusted girlfriend. If you're a guy, really, I mean, guys struggle to find guy friends, but find one and find one that you can talk to and trust. The last thing is, so I've recently started doing comedy. So this relates to communication. And it is like amazing because I'm out of my bubble. Like I'm meeting people that are so different from me, but we're all connecting and we're all talking and it's great. And it's like doing comedy makes it so now when I'm out at places, like I was at the bagel store ordering a breakfast sandwich and I'm like cracking jokes with the employees. And it's more than like how was your day? Bye. Thank you. Like we're actually connecting. It's amazing. I love it. So I'm not saying everyone should go be a comic, but what I am saying is like God has given you gifts, God has given you talents, and pursue those, use those passions. I mentioned my girl Jen Fulweiler. She's not my girl, but she'd be like, whoa girl, hold back. You do not own me. I'm just a huge fan of her. She is an author. She's currently a comedian. I promise I'm not trying to follow her in her footsteps. Like literally, this is the whole separate thing that led me to comedy. But she wrote this book. It's called Your Blue Flame. Please link to it in the show notes.
Yeah,
check it out if you haven't read it. I know so many people have read this book and they're like, yes, I have these passions. And then they just put it back on the shelf because they're like, but I'm busy. Like I have, my children need me. My husband needs me. Yeah. I don't know. They're just making excuses. And honestly, I see so many of my friends like sinking into sadness because like I see their spark fading. Like I knew these women when they were beautiful and alive and full of their passions, and now they're just bogged down by their lives and trying to be like the perfect mom, the perfect wife, perfect employee. I don't know. And they've lost their passion. So I want everyone to just like A, read this book, but then B, take it seriously and do the get unstuck thing that Jen taught. I don't know if she's going to do one again, but set a week for yourself. Like, this is the week I'm going to make this passion project happen, no matter what. And honestly, that week that I focused on my website was the week that I cleaned my house better than it had ever been cleaned. Like, that wasn't my plan. My plan was like, well, the house is going to get extra messy this week. Yeah. But I had so much more energy to clean stuff. Like, it's crazy. But that's what Jen says, is like, when you're pursuing your passions, you have more energy for your family. You have more energy for your friends. You're going to be a better person. So highly, highly recommend that. Pursue your passions, because like, doing the comedy, doing this website, like I really believe it's stuff God is, guiding me to do. And if a year ago, I was struggling with anxiety and depression because I was postpartum, it was winter, it's COVID. And I'm like, I'm never going to feel my spark again. Like I really felt that, like, I'm going to be trapped in here, like Cinderella. I'll never be able to have fun again. And I mean, there's a lot, like if you have to get medication, if you have to get therapy, if you're going through some mental health issues, please do that. Yeah. But also at the same time, please put yourself and your passions first. Because when you're doing that, then your family, then your friends, everyone else is going to be so much better for it. Yeah. So
thank you for sharing that and being honest about like your journey too, because I think that's something that I see a lot of the woe is me, I'm the martyr mom or employee or whatever it might be. And that's not what God calls us to. He calls us to live in freedom and to live in the light. And I think exactly what you said, when you are following your passions, that's not prioritizing your vocation. It fuels your vocation. It fuels it clarifies what's really important to me. And you clarify the time that you put into a passion project or hobby, whatever it might be. And it might be related to your home life. And I think that's something that when I've seen Jen talk about it, it's like, it doesn't have to be something you're making millions of dollars off of.
No,
it
doesn't have to be a side hustle.
Right. And I think that's just so important to remember, that by leaning into our passions and who God made us to be, leaning into the gifts he gives us, if he calls us, he will equip us.
Yes.
He 100%. Will equip us, and he will provide us the energy, the time, the love that we need to give to our families. And these things that he provides us with, these passion projects and these gifts, like they are used as a way to purify us and to help us become the saint that we are called to be. And that's doesn't have to live in separate worlds, or like you have to wait until you're 50. No.
In Catholic land, we have funny things. Like my friend was telling to me, like, I've got so many great things going on. And she's like, Brandy, I think you need to pray the litany of humility. That like cracked me up, that in Catholic land we have something called that litany of humility. But like, okay, yeah, I do need to pray this, because I want to make sure that what I'm doing is not just like, look at me, like bringing it back to sex. It's not about like me and getting pleasure and like, how can I just have the best time? It's about like, how can like I work with my husband to build like a great marriage, to build a great sex life. But in the same way, like, how can I use who I am as a person to like build the world up? Because we're struggling. We're all struggling hard. And it's not about me saving everyone, but it's about like letting God work through me. So there we go.
This is awesome. Thank you so much for being on. This has been great to talk about this. I'm sure you will get questions. So everything that we've talked about, we've mentioned Jen Fulwey, we mentioned her book, we mentioned Love and Responsibility, a lot of different things. I will link all of that in the show notes. And then of course your website, so that if people have more questions or they want to talk to you more, they can. But this has been great. I'm really glad that you just like been honest here and shot it straight, because we need that. And it's not all like the heady theological stuff, which is great, but we need
it. It is great. I studied it, but it's too much for us, like sinful people in the world. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I loved it.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and help expand the conversation around women's health. If you'd like to learn more about fertility awareness, visit www.managingyourfertility.com for more information, resources, guides, and so much more.